Even as the Sri Lankan government negotiates with the International Monetary Fund to borrow $3 billion, long queues of vehicles remain outside empty petrol stations. And angry citizens demand solutions for skyrocketing food prices and a debt crisis which has bankrupted the country. Most of the blame has fallen on former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was forced to resign last month.
One of the first initiatives that he did was to cut taxes across the board, which led to a slide in revenue. And unfortunately, this was soon followed by the COVID crisis, which of course devastated the government's revenue base even further, because Sri Lanka is quite dependent on the tourism trade. At the same time, it had to put out a lot more spending because of a crisis. Now, this caused the government's debt levels to rise to very high levels, and to the extent that it became very hard to refinance because investors were quite concerned about the sustainability of the government's debt trajectory. And as a result, we have come to a situation where the government is no longer able to finance a lot of its spending, and the country is unable to finance a lot of its imports, and the government is forced into a default.
External factors also came into play as the subsequent Russian invasion of Ukraine pushed up inflation and caused a global oil crisis. To combat inflation, the US Federal Reserve hiked interest rates aggressively, which was also bad news for Sri Lanka and other developing economies.
The current account positions have deteriorated. Those countries that are exporters of commodities have done reasonably better. So some of the LATAM economies have done better, but most emerging market importers of commodities and those that rely more on revenues from domestic consumption, etc., have come under a lot of pressure. So debt levels have generally been on the rise. The cost of debt has increased, paying this debt off, because of the strength in, or the rise in US interest rates, and higher US yields in general have had an impact. And at the same time, the strength in the dollar has also impacted the ability to pay off these debts.
Some are worried that Sri Lanka is just the first domino to fall and that other developing nations will follow. In April, a report from the United Nations said that 69 economies are being impacted by these three global risks: rising food prices, rising energy prices, and tougher financial conditions. 19 of these countries are in Latin America, 25 in Africa, and 25 in the Asia-Pacific region.
The risks are rising. Don't forget, we are in a period of rising interest rates globally, and that is creating a number of stresses in the global system. Risk aversion is rising, asset prices are under pressure, and investors are basically reviewing their risk appetites and so on.
That said, experts are more optimistic about the Southeast Asian region, as central banks here have kept a close eye on debt levels. A lesson learnt from the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s.
Generally, the governments here have been wary and have put in place policies, regulations, and so on to try and contain the speed and scale of foreign debt. What's interesting is that in the last few years, we've noticed that the currencies that used to be vulnerable in this part of the world, the rupiah, the Philippine peso, have become much more resilient to stresses in other parts of the emerging world. And I think that reflects a recognition in financial markets that our resilience has improved, that our fundamentals have improved.
So what should governments do to prevent a collapse similar to the one in Sri Lanka?
For debt sustainability, you really need investors to be willing to buy your new debt when you refinance your old debt. And investors are most willing to buy when they feel that the overall setting, the economic story, the government's policies support a growth trajectory that allow the government's income to continue growing, and the government has the willingness to use this income stream to pay them off, or at least essentially to pay off the debts that they incur.
But even if a global debt crisis is averted, there still could be some impact if more countries default on their debt obligations.
It won't be a case where we see a massive amount of contagion. I think that seems unlikely. A lot of these countries aren't huge, don't have a huge impact in terms of the financial sector globally. That said, of course, if you have a number of different debt crises in several emerging market countries, that of course has a big impact in terms of the ability of emerging market countries generally to borrow.